Today I'm joined by religion journalist and author of Reorganized Religion, Bob Smietana. We talk about the state of organized religion, how he felt about landing that exclusive interview with Beth Moore, and if we should burn all of organized religion down to the ground and start over.
I don't know if we need a crisis, but the world supplies its own crises.
Yes, it does.
And then what do you do in those crises? In the crisis,
Yeah.
You can turn on each other or you can get to work. Then they pick up the swords and start beating up each other. And they start making up stories about why the other people are so terrible. One guy's like, they killed my brother. And the other character's like, wait, you don't have a brother. And I'm not I guess I shouldn't say this. I'm really interesting. You should all listen to this podcast. But, I don't want to know what I think. I want to know what other people think.
This is Amy Fritz, and you're listening to Untangled Faith, a podcast for anyone who has found themselves confused or disillusioned in their faith journey. If you want to hold on to your faith while untangling it from all the things that are not good and true, this is the place for you. Hey friends, I know what it's like to know you should do something, but you just can't figure out a way to actually do it. I bet getting started with a counselor is one of those things. Faithful Counseling makes it so easy to get started. You can start the process without even picking up the phone to talk to someone. The Untangled Faith podcast is brought to you by my listeners who support me on Patreon. But this episode is also brought to you by Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states with access by video or phone sessions or chat or text. There are therapists with expertise in trauma, depression, family conflicts, and more. You can ask for a new counselor at any time, and financial aid is available for those who qualify. Untangled Faith podcast listeners get 10% off their first month from our sponsor, Faithful Counseling. Go to faithfulcounseling.com/untangled. Fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a counselor. That's faithfulcounseling.com/untangled. Bob Smietana has been on the podcast previously, but this time we're talking about his new book, Reorganized Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters. Bob has worked the God beat of religion journalism for 2 decades. If anyone has a right to feel a little jaded, it's Bob. And yet when I read his book, I found myself surprisingly emotional as he shared why this isn't just a job or an intellectual pursuit for him. It's personal. Here's our conversation. I have a list of questions for you.
Oh, gosh. There you go.
Not hard ones. But you write for a living.
Yes.
And you decided to write a book.
Yes, I did.
Why this one? And I'm assuming this isn't the first book that you've written. Probably had the itch to write a book. But why did this capture you?
A couple things. I'm really interested in this topic, right? I'm interested in all the change and the complexity of the change and the important role religious groups play and that they're disappearing. And there are downsides to disappearing. So one of them is the community service part. The other part is this like social capital part. We're not learning how, and the way churches are changing to be more monocultural is also changing the way that we interact as a culture. We don't have these kind of cross-cutting places where people
the big sorts impacting our churches.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But so we don't have these places where we learn how to disagree. And I was telling someone, I wonder if some of the conflict in the culture and in big denominations is because you've lost sort of the places where you had congregational polity, where people had to argue with people that are going to stay around for a long time.
Yeah, that you live by, that you work with, that you're going to like hang out at the park with, play baseball with.
In the church, and you have a kind of incentive to get along with these people and listen to them, even though it still makes it different than like a town hall meeting. If town hall meeting, you are going to live with these people, but you don't have this kind of common identity or this religious impulse to get along, where churches have that, and some of that is missing. So that's a big part of it. I think it took a long time to get it together because it's, I could write about all kinds of things. I could write about cat cults and
Yes.
I would actually want to write a book about leadership issues at big churches and the problems of them, the kind of celebrity issues of churches. And I kind of pitched an idea around, couldn't get it. And and then Caitlin Beatty has this book called Celebrities with Jesus. And so I'm really impressed by that book for two reasons. One, it's a great topic. And two, she got somebody to say yes to it, because it's a hard pitch. It's hard to pitch a book, and it's hard to do it. And then it's hard to say, like, you send it out in the world and then you don't know. Will people read it? Will they connect with it? But I felt like this is worth spending my time asking people about. And there's great stories that people don't know.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I think about writing in more this modern world is that while it's still very solitary, you get to put out some ideas into the world through social media and see how people are reacting as you're working on things. So you can get an idea if people are interested and resonating more than you would maybe even a decade or 2 decades ago. So
yeah, I think there's that too. And then you can get the ideas out in the public and see. And I actually just went the other night and talked to some people about this in Wisconsin at this church. It was great. It was great to meet with people in person. It's like, this is weird. A meeting, because I've done some book events online, but they're different. A live audience is much better, and you have they had great questions. Someone asked me if they were just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Oh wow, yeah.
And then how do they adapt and stay faithful to what they want to believe and what they do, and people want to figure out how to do this and understand what are all the reasons why it's difficult.
One thing, I do have a question along the lines there of what you said. You have looked at all of this research. You've talked to a lot of people. You've spent two decades in the religion God beat world of writing. And you talk about this trajectory of our world being more pluralistic, right? And that is one of the pitfalls that some of the organized religion denominations are having to grapple with. If the world is more pluralistic, but I really do have some strong feelings about what my theology is, if the only way my church is going to last is if I'm willing to collaborate with people that I don't necessarily agree with, how does that work? And how can I do that, Bob? I think there are some people that are like, is that unfaithful? Is that wrong? It makes me think of Bob Roberts and how he does all this stuff with all these different faiths. But people don't, I know that he's had some pushback, but like, what are your thoughts on that?
So a couple of things. So if you look at this thing that's happening in Martha's Vineyard right now, as we speak, so it's mid-September, a group of Venezuelan refugees get dropped on a plane in Martha's Vineyard. Yeah. And Martha's Vineyard is an interesting place. It's it's a summer vacation spot. So if you grew up in Massachusetts like I did, you'd go there, right? We went on our youth group annual bike trip on Martha's Vineyard. That was our thing to do. So it's a vacation spot. There's also really wealthy folks there. Yeah. Obama has a house there. And then the rest of the year, it's a place where people live. When the tourists are all gone, people still have to make a living and live there. So that's a different world.
Yeah.
But, Massachusetts isn't the Bible Belt. So in the Bible Belt, Christians are used to being in charge, and Protestant Christians, especially evangelicals, are used to being in charge. And the East Coast, the Catholic Church was the largest group. The other groups are smaller. There's more Jewish folks, but there's still, religion isn't in charge anymore. And so that makes it easier for people to collaborate because they're small enough to know, like, we are all peers here. We have to work on this. This is our community. We love these folks. What is our job? To take care of our community. I think you're seeing actually a couple places, some real robust interfaith work and not ecumenical work. Sometimes ecumenical, which is a great word, but it can mean a kind of lowest common denominator working together, where I think you see in interfaith work, people who are very clear on what they believe, but they also are clear that the goal is to do some things to help the community. So we can do that, and you can collaborate with people because you're neighbors with them. And your neighbors are not always going to believe the same thing or think the same way or go to your church, but you all have a stake in the health of the neighborhood.
Yeah, the common good.
Yeah.
And so that should, are you arguing, Bob, that should be more important than our fear that somebody might end up at the wrong church in the end.
I suppose. I mean, that's what I mean. So here's the funny thing is this. So churches were built for a world where most people were going to go to a worship or be part of a congregation, right? Of some kind. And it was mostly Christian. And so all the different Christians were competing for market share.
Yeah.
And sometimes the competing was we're the right church. We're better than those other people. Those people are wrong. Sometimes it was we're the right church for you. Not necessarily that we are, the other people are wrong, but we're better match for you. And then you had the kind of Protestant mid 1900s, actually most of the 1900s, fight between Catholics and Protestants, where the Protestants were thinking the Catholics were a threat. And now you're in a world where you have to kind of convince people that going to church or being spiritual or being involved in organized religion is part of their lives or could be part of their lives. You're not competing for a market share. You're just competing for any kind of attention.
Sure.
Because people don't think this matters. And so it's a different kind of world. But if you're set up for we expect people to show up on our door and we're going to give them a good experience so they stay, you're missing out that the world is a place where people are just not going to show up. And you're going to have to think about, what do we offer? How do we connect with people and show them that this is worth paying attention to and that there might be a place in this community for them?
Yeah. And it's not necessarily, like you said, the lowest common denominator that is making people work together when it comes to like this Martha's Vineyard thing with these immigrants. Like these people, they're like, this is very good work.
Yeah.
This is what we're about.
Yeah.
And it's more important than like whether we believe in predestination or not, or infant baptism.
And there are all kinds of outside forces working on churches and all kinds of conflict right now that religious groups get drawn into and narratives. And so I think that one thing that churches have to, and other faith groups have to be wary of is whose narrative is running the show. Are you in someone else's narrative, or are you doing what you think is the right thing? And you find common cause with people, but what's the goal that you're after? Because different people have different kinds of goals.
Yeah. And can we do this without putting a sign up that says, this good work was brought to you by?
Yeah. I don't know if people have, I suppose it's good for people to know that there are collaborations because you want people to support what you do.
Yeah.
I think that most of the work that gets done, actually, people don't say anything about because they don't pay any attention to.
If there's an urgency,
outside the church, if there's
we don't have time to make a T-shirt. We don't have time to make a sign for that.
So, like, one of my favorite stories is the story of this little church in Smyrna called All Saints, which is an Episcopal church that had a church feud and during the Episcopal Church Wars. So a group of people leave, and they have left. It's a fairly new church, actually, but they leave a handful of people with a big mortgage and no way to survive, and they leave these friends behind. And these people are like, "What do we do? We thought we were here for the long time, and then now we're stuck." Yeah. And then these refugees show up and save this church, and the Episcopal Diocese is doing this. Nobody knows about it. I only find out because I go to another church and the pastor kind of, after we're done with an interview, offhandedly says, yeah, we're going to work on this church being saved by refugees. And I think, what? Why aren't you leading with this? Why aren't you getting up and saying we're doing this? No, they're not saying anything. They're just not saying anything at all.
Yeah.
They don't.
And that ends up being the work.
The work, yeah.
Or the story. The story that actually happens when people think they're done talking to you about the thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's the way that works. But there are kind of this more, and they're just doing what they do. They don't think, oh, this is what we do. You should pay attention to us. They're like, hey, we need to do this thing because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And you talk about that in your book, that particular story with that church in Smyrna. And so when you say that this refugee community saved the church, they wanted a place to worship, and the church had resources. They had land. That was really interesting. They did stuff with farming.
Yeah, they had like a farmer's market sort of thing going on, or little farm, to raise some money for the place. They've continued to have a vibrant presence there. It gets some money from the diocese. What's a couple things fascinating about it is, one, I kind of feel bad for the people who left.
Mm.
No, they had started their own church. They're fine.
Yeah.
But they missed this other thing that they could have been involved in. And maybe it had to go this way because people could show up where the church was small and wasn't in charge and filled with a lot of people. They were just trying to all survive together.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to so people get a lot more done when they are working side by side and when they really have a crisis to get something done versus when they're not and they're thinking about all the other things that could that take their attention.
Yeah.
When they're thinking about church feuds, what ends up happening is new people that come in get drawn into those church feuds.
So
or they come for the feud.
We need a crisis, like a real crisis that's beyond like what should the carpet be every so often to get us distracted.
I don't know if we need a crisis, but the world supplies its own crises.
Yes, it does.
And then what do you do in those crises? In the crisis, you can turn on each other or you can get to work.
Yeah. So the premise of your book is that the world is changing. Mm-hmm. And if organized religion doesn't change with it, it's not going to exist. It's not going to exist the way it does exist now.
Yeah.
And it has to make some shifts. Now, here's a relevant portion from Bob's book. During the heyday of the so-called church growth movement, which fueled the rise of many of the nation's largest Protestant megachurches, there was a phrase that was commonly used to promote this new, hip way of doing church. We are not your grandmother's church. That phrase was splashed on billboards and repeated on best-selling books and promotional material for new churches across the country. Bob goes on to say, but the bigger picture facing churches is this. Your grandmother is the one keeping churches alive. You've seen the data. How is this different than every other generation, Bob? Hasn't every generation said, this is it? This is the end?
So a couple things. So you have... So Pew Research just did this long report on looking at what does religion look like in America in 2070. Mm-hmm. And for their model, they looked at the age and demographics of the current population. They looked at birth rates. They looked at transmission rates of the faith from one generation to another. They looked at religious switching, which is the people going in and out. So, a couple things that religious sociologists know. So about a third of people leave the religion they grew up in by the time they're 30.
Yeah. And
actually an growing number of people who are older than 30 are leaving. But still, the primarily is 430, about a third leave. And only about 20% of people, those who grow up with no religion, choose a religion. So they switch less. So more people go out of Christianity than come in from non-Christians. And the average Christian is 43. The average non-religious person is 33. So even though religious people have more kids, they're getting older. So you have an older and older. So at some point they're too old to have kids. So their growth rate's going to close. So you have you have a couple things. You have a changing of transmission of faith from one generation to another. You have a lot more switching out of faith. You have fewer kids being born. And then you have all the other changes. So you have a loss of interest in institutions in general. And you have the big sort where you're only interested in being around people who are like you. You have a changing demographics where the country. So when I was born in 1965, 85% of the country was white. Almost everyone was Christian. Men were in charge. The ideal couple was a man and a woman. Very, very either traditional or heteronormative world, right?
Yeah.
So that's all changed. And religion was in a prime place in society. So now we're moving to a multi-ethnic, pluralistic world where it's egalitarian and LGBT friendly. And that's a whole different world. When our granddaughter is born in December, she will be born to a world where half the people are white and half are not. So it's a much more diverse world. So and people who go to church now, so among young people who are religiously identify, they're already in equal numbers. So it used to be 5 or 6 to 1 where white Christians and non-white Christians were in the church. Well, now among young people, it's about 1 to 1. So that's a whole different thing too,
So
because
there's
that,
like the data is there.
yeah,
This
the
isn't
data's
just
there.
a hunch that
No, no,
things
no.
are
So
changing.
there's no mathematical model in which Christianity increases. Now it could, because all kinds of other things could happen, but it's not just that you have the difference between the normal differences of generational change. You have a generation that's much younger that is very different ethnically and sociologically than the older generation.
So, which demographics or which sorts of churches do you think will be most taken by surprise by this? I would think that there are some that are a little bit insulated from these changes. And they're like, Bob, you have no idea. We just keep having all these baptisms and babies.
Yeah.
And
So the other thing that's going on is that the average church, two things have happened with churches. So the average church used to be 137 people, 2000, in 2000, according to the Faith Communities Today study. Average church today, 65 people. Now, the average person goes to a church of 300 to 400 people. So a lot of people who go to church go to big churches. So that you don't always see that. There was this idea for a long time that conservative churches would grow, liberal churches would not. That has been proved not to be true. Basically, monoethnic.
there was a lag,
There was a
right?
lag. There was a lag
Yeah.
because the birth rates were different. Now the birth
Yeah.
rates have caught up. And so if you look at one of the churches that's had the most decline in the last 15 years is the Southern Baptist Convention. Just lost 2 million people in about 15 years.
Yeah. And
because
they were so proud
yeah,
early on about how they weren't losing the numbers. Some of
yeah,
the other,
they will hold off a little bit because they plant new churches,
yeah.
but you can't get new churches in fast enough to replace the people who are going to die and close. You have a couple of churches that are doing pretty well. You have the Assemblies of God, which is in the same kind of area as the um, Southern Baptists. They have two advantages. One, they're Pentecostals, and Pentecostals are
Yeah.
growing right now. And two, they're multi-ethnic.
Yeah. They're less
That's really,
white.
yeah. So that helps them grow. But the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, for example, very, very conservative. They are shrinking. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is progressive, they are shrinking. Any church denomination that's mostly white is shrinking. That's mostly birth rate driven and transmission from one person to another.
That's fascinating. You argue, though, in your book, this isn't a problem. This doesn't necessarily have to be a threat, right? It feels like a threat.
Yeah,
If your number is, if you're used to a certain comfort in the way you do things, a change feels weird. It's awkward.
Change always feels weird. I hate it when we go to Chick-fil-A and up here we can't get the regular chicken fingers or chicken tenders, right? We only get the spicy ones.
Bob.
And you're like, I would like the regular chicken fingers. No, you can't get them. We don't have them. Imagine dealing with all this change at the same time and a world that used to think you were great and now is hostile to you in some ways.
Yeah, I sent my dad the book Jesus and John Wayne, and he was like, I feel like I'm the bad guy in this book.
It's hard to have when people distrust you or feel you have been oppressive or feel you haven't listened to them. That's hard. It's hard to listen to them. And as it's going to get worse as churches get more diverse because you'll have more points of view saying, hey, here's the things we haven't told you before, but we're not real happy about them. And how do people listen to that? And how do people work together? That's going to be a real issue.
Yeah. Tell me about what you are seeing in regards to the communities that are lasting, the ones that are set up to work well in this new world.
Well, I don't know if anyone's set up to new work well.
I mean, you've done a little bit.
There are churches that are adapting. There are churches that are changing. One of my favorite stories in the book is this church called Quest Church, which is out in Seattle. And they really were founded as a new, younger, Asian American, mostly multi-ethnic church. They were meeting on the grounds of an older white church. And the older white church was fine, but they were thinking, nah, we don't have a real long-term plan. So they end up merging. They end up actually, so they're still doing well. They ended up buying the building that was owned by Mars Hill Church when Mars Hill collapsed. But now they're planning other similar multi-ethnic churches. So about 1 in 4 churches in the country is multi-ethnic. That's going pretty well. I think big churches have an advantage right now in that they have more time to think about.
Yeah.
They're not in the same boat that small churches are. I mean, every church though is dealing with this crisis of like, well, who does it mean? What does it mean to be a church in the 21st century with all these changes?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
especially post peak COVID, we think
Oh,
we're in year 3 of COVID,
yeah.
and year 3 of COVID is not the same as before COVID. People
Yeah.
aren't coming back. People are not volunteering as much as they do. They're still dealing with the aftermath of this. We're still all riven with dissension and anger over the changes in the country, and the pandemic accentuated those changes.
Yeah.
So
Everything's heightened.
people that are aware of this are at least talking about it and saying, oh, what do we do? And how do we move forward? The answer is not to fight about it. If you're fighting about it, that's not so great.
Yes, let's
And
talk
there,
about this.
and there are people who are, I mean, there are some congregations that are saying that are using polarization and anger and
Yeah.
no COVID as a recruitment strategy. And
Yeah,
that's working
you
for some
can
people.
really inspire people
Yeah.
with
Are you going to
fear and
attract people?
anger.
Oh, is it going to be, is that a long-term strategy? I
Yeah.
don't know. That's one of the things that
Yeah.
people are choosing.
You have a quote in the book that surprised me.
Oh, did it? Oh, which one?
Only a fool fights in a burning house. Where did that come
It
from?
comes from Star Trek. It comes
It
from
comes from
the
Star
Day of the
Trek.
Dove, my favorite Star Trek episode, in which the members, the crew of the Enterprise comes. If you know anything about Star Trek, the
Yeah.
Enterprise, the spaceship, they come along. They encounter this Klingon ship, which is in trouble. They say, "Oh, we're going to help you out," and then the Klingons say, "No, we're going to take over your ship," and they're all fighting. And then all of a sudden, they're fighting with swords. All the modern weapons gone away, and people are, and nobody in the ship goes, where did all the modern weapons go? Then they pick up the swords and start beating up each other, and they start making up stories about why the other people are so terrible. One guy's like, they killed my brother, and the other character's like, wait, you don't have a brother. And they make up
Yeah.
these
All good.
grievances against each other. And then they finally realize an alien has put them up to all this, and they decide to stop. And then one of the Klingon guys throws down his sword and says that only, we hate these other humans, but only a fool fights in a burning house.
Yes.
Which I think is super. It's a very helpful metaphor, because what do you do in a crisis? Like, the worst thing you could do is turn on each other.
Mhm.
I had this talk with the head of the Christian Council of Churches in Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Basically said we don't need to be unified in fear. That churches and other faith groups have had adapted to many different communities, many different places. But if they lead with fear, that's not going to help anybody.
Right. I see this opportunity that's also kind of a scary thing, to have these conversations, theological conversations, where we say, like, what are deal breakers for us and what aren't deal breakers for us? And can we really talk about where that came from? Is it a cultural thing? Is it actually there? And I think we are seeing more and more people, and I would say the younger generation is leading the way and saying, okay, I was just talking to Lori Wilbert, and she just wrote the book called Curious Faith.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, I'm more comfortable now with uncertainty than I have been in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, I feel really strong about the creeds of Christianity.
Yeah.
The rest, I'm willing to have the conversation. That feels like it could be scary for people, but I feel like there is a possibility that opens up for the future of the church. Like, you can believe some things really strongly and that they have really big repercussions, and also be like, but I'm not exactly sure if that's just me, if this is heresy.
Yeah. I mean, these are all, what are the boundaries you're going to use, and how are you going to interpret these things?
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things we see is a willingness among people, old and young, to distance themselves from people pretty quickly. We don't have a real stickiness of that we have all, or many people have adopted basically a consumer mentality. So this is an idea called affective polarization, that your identity is stacked together, and the way you get things done as a group is to figure out who you don't like, and then you motivate people to fight against the people they don't like, even though the people they don't like might have some of the same ideas. And so we don't have spaces where people can stick together. Now, church leadership can be, at the same time, we've had this kind of slimmed down church leadership where only the leaders in charge, and they don't want to give people the mics because they're afraid of what they might say. They're afraid they might disagree, and it makes it messier. but we don't have the kind of messy discussions that make it easier for people to go forward. Like we've talked about the whole Dave Ramsey thing, right?
Yeah.
A lot, as we know. And one of the things that's really interesting about that organization is the kind of the fear of dissent or the fear of questions or the fear of conversation.
Sure.
It's an efficiency model, right? It works more efficiently for everyone to be on the same page and just say, be quiet and do your job. That may work and a business may not work, but it's not as great for a complex world where you're trying to solve a complex problem. And it's not great for teaching people how to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
And so we end up in some places with a kind of list of a transactional relationship.
Yeah.
We love you if you do X, Y, Z. And then there's a lookout for anyone who violates X, Y, and Z. And then the option to violate X, Y, Z is shunning. So if somebody's become Amish in these ways, or
although we would never say that we do this shame-based thing.
I mean, there's all kinds of shunning going on because people, and you see this on social media, you see it. I get hurt. I don't know how to say I'm hurt. I say I'm hurt. But you can also come to people and say, I've been hurt.
Yeah.
And there may not be a way to say, I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. Oh, what should I do? How can I communicate with you?
Especially if you don't know how to fix it. These are the sorts of conversations I'm having with my 73-year-old dad.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. How do I do that? For the first time in his life, he's doing therapy because he loves me. And to have the therapist say, hey, you are a great fixer, Steve. But what if you're trying to fix the wrong problem?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like to know what the real problem is? And I think there's some analogy to that with our organized religion. What is the real problem? We'll be right back after a quick break. Are you ready to take this relationship to the next level? The Patreon community is the primary way this podcast is funded, and I would love for you to join us there. As a thank you for their support, my patrons receive access to bonus audio that doesn't get shared with everyone else. Today, I'll be sharing bonus audio from this conversation with Bob Smietana. And that's where I'll be sharing content while I take a break from my regular schedule. You can access all of this by going to patreon.com/untangledfaith. That's patreon.com/untangledfaith. Before I jump back into the conversation with Bob, I wanted to share this quote from his book. Despite all its flaws, and there are legion, organized religion can be a source for good in the world. That good work is in danger now. I wrote down one of the quotes from your book. You said, well, most Americans still believe in God or some kind of higher power or spirituality. Fewer and fewer have ties to organized religion.
Yeah.
Here's my response. So what?
Okay, a couple things. So one, I would say that disorganized religion has its own problems in that, especially if it's disorganized in a way that you have unbridled spiritual power and no boundaries. That never ends well.
Right.
The other thing is disorganized religion. I mean, it's a different world that if we have a bunch of people praying on their own, seeking out enlightenment on their own, worshiping on their own, wherever they are, and a group of people that organize together, that meet together, that worship together. And then that organization channels their goodwill or their values out into the world. So it's different because...
Right. So if I just say, it's Bob, burn it down, you would say there are some issues with burning it down.
Well, I mean, I would
say...
The
organized part. The
organized part is important, right? Because the organized... So we were having this discussion on social media about, do you need buildings? I was tweeting about some of this. Do you need buildings? Do you need staff? Well, to get... And it's so a couple things. There are people who say, we just go back to the early church. There was no buildings, no structure, no organization. Well, first, they were getting murdered. Second, they were a startup. And the first century is a much less complex world institutionally than our world is. There are a lot less people. And third, it wasn't very long before they built institutions, and then those institutions were fighting with each other and had become politically involved. I mean, with patrons in the by the emperors. Different factions of the church had patrons with different parts of the imperial family. That didn't go so well. So
and
it
we don't
wasn't
want to
like
go back to that. We don't really
it
want to
wasn't
go
like
back
the
to that.
early church or any of the early churches have ever been very awesome. They had issues. They've always had issues. But I think the organized part really matters because, okay, here's an example. So just recently, a group of Venezuelan refugees get sent from Florida and land on Martha's Vineyard. What are we going to do? And they've got very little luggage with them. They don't know where they're going. There's no one there to no one
They
is
didn't know
prepared
they
for
were
them.
going there.
They didn't know they were going there, and the island doesn't know they're showing up. What do we do? So within fairly quick notice, there was already a social service institution there. They call the churches who are already institutions there. They identify who has a building. The Episcopalians have a building. They have a church hall that's set up, which has showers, which has bathrooms, which has beds, which has They have a place to go. They have food because they are already in the process of stockpiling food for the winter where there's homeless ministry going on.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think there are unhoused people on Martha's Vineyard. Turns out there are. And there's food insecurity on Martha's Vineyard. So they already have all the resources. They've been thinking about this a long time and have put years and years of effort. So when a crisis hits, they have all the training and networking and facilities set. They don't have to make that up. They can just put it into action. Right. If you don't have that, then who's going to do this? And social media is great for instituting fast responses and raising money. So if you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge for ALS a few years ago, that raised millions of dollars. It didn't solve ALS. It had to go to institutions to take that money and say, now you go figure out how to treat people, how to solve this disease, because complex problems require institutions and planning and strategy and money and people.
Because there's organized religion, there was a building. There's a list of people that they could reach out to. They have some names of people. Yeah.
So there we go. That's one of the kind of issues.
All right. Okay. So I don't want to burn it all down.
Burning. I mean, I guess forest fires sometimes work, but burning everything down leaves so much, especially burning it down in an
uncontrolled burn.
Uncontrolled burn is not good for anybody because there's collateral damage. There's enormous collateral damage and startup costs. I mean, you're talking about institutions that trace their beginnings thousands of years, right? In churches, it's 2,000 years. In churches and synagogues, it's 5,000 years. In other religious traditions, it's tens of thousands. These are long-term institutions that have been shaped by history, and you can't replace all that. You can't go back to the early church either and just restart over because you've lost all that value. Plus, starting something new, I would. This is a long answer, but I would imagine it's what like people who start dating after a divorce or after being widowed.
Yeah.
You can't replace that other relationship.
You have to do this work again.
You have to do this work again, and you have to start all over again, and you have to invest that and rebuild.
That's why when people get married, they're like, "I'm so glad I don't have to be dating anymore."
It's why moving from church to church is hard because you're creating a new network of friends and family, and it's like finding that's not easy. So I think that the organized part matters. The impulse to burn everything down it's worth listening to. What is the frustration? Not every human institutions are going to be flawed because they're human.
Yeah.
And you can't get rid of the people and have an institution. And the trick is to make sure the institution serves the mission and the institution is shaped by the values of the people, not that it serves an end in itself. And that can be the problem. That was the Southern Baptist Convention's problem. Dealing with sexual abuse, right? Sexual abuse. None of the people in the pews would think that you want to shun sexual abuse survivors.
Right.
That you'd want to have a pastor who was abusive, go from one church to another church. And so, and dealing with abuse in the church is already hard because it's your pastor. How do I believe this? There's already a lot of problems there, but nobody wants to build an abusive culture. But it's easy for the institution to say, well, we're going to protect all these other things. And one great thing about the Southern Baptists is when the people in churches and the people in the pews had a chance to vote at their meetings, they said, well, we want to know what's going on here and we want to fix it. They were not going to mess with, they were not swayed by the ideas that there's too much risk or there's too much institutional threat. They were like, no, we don't want to be part of an institution that's abusive. And no one wants to be part of that. I would think like going through counseling with your dad. It's probably not simple.
Yeah.
It's probably not pain-free. And maybe you're doing it and you're in a good place, but had you been at each other's odds, and it may expose things that you didn't think you knew and maybe you don't want to know.
Yeah, that just totally resonates because there's part of us that says, man, it would be easier if the whole thing could be burnt down because I don't have to do the work of sifting between the good and the bad. But if you actually do have a love and value of this relationship or this institution, and there's something that is worth saving, then you do put that energy. You do invest that energy, even though you're like, oh, it'll be easier if the whole thing was a disaster. I marked page 193 of the book. It's close to the end, probably right before the last chapter. You said, sometimes I think a church or other faith community is a bit like a gas station on a lonely country road. You can drive by for years and never notice it. Then one night, perhaps late, running out of gas or with something going wrong, you see the lights and pull in. It's there when you need it because someone left the lights on and kept the door open. It sounds personal to you, Bob.
It is.
It's more than a job.
It is. And I love this stuff. And I write a book in some ways about how churches have affected my life when I was in crisis, when my younger brother died, when our marriage was in trouble early on. Yeah. People were there. And I think, well, what if there isn't someone there when you're in that crisis? What happens to those people? And,
you said Grace Covenant Church in North Chicago.
Yeah, it's a small church in Chicago. It's just, and the church is closed. So it was really difficult. They couldn't survive COVID. It's a very small congregation. Started in the 1800s by Swedish immigrants to serve the Swedish immigrants on Chicago's north side. And they adapted. So they were, two churches ended up merging. One of them spoke Swedish in worship services till the late 20s. Right. Wow. So then they changed to English, right? From Swedish to English. Then they keep adapting. And then they're about to close and they revise. They had been tremendously, and the people there who were older, it wasn't very simple or easy. It's not easy when a bunch of young people come in your church and they bring in a drum set, and they play different music, and they do all these things that you wouldn't do. And there's all the order and structure that you had relied on for years had been thrown out the window. And here's the funny thing. The two churches merged in the 60s. And apparently, even until the 80s, when they'd have a church function, they had two sets of dishes. Whose dishes do we use? The one churches or the other churches? This was a big deal. They had to swap off so nobody felt, right? So they kept those. And I'm sure the people were not like real happy. What is this? Music? But then we had the sound of babies and people. Yeah. So I think there is this kind of... that church was really important to us. But COVID, they had the same problems as everybody else. They've been 175 people, then 80 people, then pre-COVID, then COVID, they're 40 people. And the building needs some work. And do we spend a lot of money on our building? And when you get that small, you don't have enough people to kind of plan for the future.
Yeah.
And it requires enormous amounts of energy when you get that small to say, if we would like to have a long-term future, we have to do things differently again. And they just ran out of steam on that, I think. Yeah. So they sell the building, and that'll be used to start new churches, which can happen, right? It's better than not selling the building, fixing it up, basically spending every last penny, and then closing. They sort of that thought, this isn't the case, that we can't keep going. But it's sad to see because they won't be there for people. And that community won't be there. And there's a loss for those folks because they have to go start over. So there is a kind of there's always going to be losses in this. And it's going to be difficult. But there's hopefulness that some things could happen you don't expect. Yeah. Like this church kept reviving in unexpected ways. And so there's sort of this idea. I like the gas station idea because there's work to be done to just be faithful, doing the right thing, and keeping things going, and being prepared when the people show up.
And then they get to do that best of the best, not the worst of the worst that you see that can happen in that. Like, there are some really, really good things that just come from being faithfully being there with the lights on.
Yeah. And there are people who come back to congregations even though they've had really bad experiences. I think there's going to be a whole set of clergy and congregations that are going to have to figure out, how do I deal with people's pain from the past and bring them into something new and help them heal for that.
Yeah, but the religious term of being the mission field, right? I do think that those people are a new, really difficult mission field.
Or the hospital. There's the hospital idea that people come in with their wounds, and how do you help them? That they still want to give this a chance, but there's going to be,
and everybody feels a little skeptical.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of good trust building skills right now. We've had in the past, and so religious groups churches can take the skills they had from the past and go, oh, how do I apply this? People know how to build complex congregations of trust over long term. They know how to do this. This is in the kind of DNA of what churches and other faith groups do. It takes intentionality and energy and humbleness. But, if you have the way that church can be practiced in this sort of streamed down Coldplay and a TED Talk worship, right? You don't get group prayer. You don't get group confession of sin. You don't get forgiveness of sin. You don't get group rituals. You don't have the congregational meeting that you talk about things and work together. You don't get to pray together and participate. So we have lost some soft skills in our congregations because we've moved to a simplified, and some churches have moved to what they call a simple church, where they don't do very many things. They've cut out all things. All those kind of like ministries they had, or groups they had, the Tuesday night Bible study, the moms outing, the whatever committee. Those committees actually taught people soft skills on how to get along, and allowed people and said to people, you are important, that this will survive because you are here. And we have moved to some models that say, we don't really need you. We just need you to be a cog in this machine. Keep it going. Well, then people say, okay, I'm just a cog in a machine. They don't have relationships or input or buy-in they might otherwise.
That's fascinating.
I don't know if that's
you're
true.
Learning, you're learning some different skills when you show up for the 6:30 a.m. men's Bible study. When you're sitting next to those guys.
You're learning things. You're learning about and to get
taking turns picking up the biscuits. Taking turns leading the discussion,
finding the place and leading the discussion, and disagreeing with each other and sticking together with folks.
I don't know. In the book, you talk about these other gatherings that aren't religious related, and wondering how they will be sustained.
Yeah.
Can they? Is there enough going on there that keeps people willing to keep showing up together?
Yep.
It's interesting. It really is. At some point, I shifted to asking Bob some questions about things he had seen and experienced as a religion journalist.
Yeah.
Let the chips fall. It was not long ago, a pastor had said to you in an interaction, I think it was about some of your reporting on Andy Wood. Yeah. Hey, if I faithfully serve all these years, you're never gonna write a story about me, Bob.
Yeah.
But if I mess up, you're gonna write a story about me.
Well, yeah. I suppose it's like if your house, if it's not an accident, I won't write about there not being an accident. And we write about people all the time. I mean, it is complicated. It is complicated to have people come to you and say, hey, I hear there's a problem. And then you don't want to, and then you're like, you didn't pay attention to anything I did before. It's just my whole life is going to be judged by this.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky. I get it.
It's tricky. And this is,
I want to tell them, like, I had responded to that and said, praise God if that happens. Praise God if your name never ends up in an article. I think there's an interesting, there is this interesting, especially like pastors of a certain size church, and like using social media means that more than just their church is going to see them and interact with them. And there's the upsides and downsides to it. But there is an interesting push-pull where you have a public platform and you really do kind of like the public praise but you
Yeah.
don't really want the public scrutiny. And so
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things we're seeing, especially when it comes to religion journalism, is that there is public scrutiny when somebody has more of a public face, because
Yeah.
they impact more than the 50 people in their community.
Yeah.
Although those 50 people in the community are very important and their lives are very much impacted, but like the outsized impact that the accelerant of social media has put
Yes.
on these
Oh, yeah.
has
Yeah.
changed the whole way of reporting.
And the way that we have turned, so there's a whole bunch of things going on there. So that whole pastor plagiarism question is
Yeah.
complicated on a million
Yeah, Alex
levels.
had asked you about that. Alex went to the church with me at
Yeah.
Franklin when we had that experience with our pastor.
There's like, is the pastor plagiarizing all the time?
Yeah.
Then there's the second part of churches are bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're no longer just talking to their people, they're streaming them to all kinds of people.
What do their
content
elders
Yeah.
expect of them? What kind of conversations have they
Yeah.
had internally about what their expectation is
And
of a pastor?
yeah, the content is monetized in a way. So you're not just talking to people and giving a sermon.
Yeah.
You're creating content that is monetized and you're broadcasting it, and you pick up phrases from all kinds of different people.
Mhm.
So you are, there's the intentional deception. There is the, when you know that you got this from somewhere and it's a key point in your thing and you say, wait, I want to make sure, so because people will take that, clip it, and the way you have lost control of the message and its dissemination and disseminating in places where you maybe not thought it was going to go, that makes it more complicated.
It sure does. Yeah.
And then the question of like, if someone calls you and say, did you do this thing? There's no incentive for the church to say, oh, because there's no relationship. Like it's hard to hear critique from anybody.
Oh,
it's hard to hear
I don't want to hear critique.
Relationship. So if you have if you set up a system where church leaders are detached from their people in significant ways, and certainly detached from people outside, and someone says to them, but they have in social media where we're all on the same page, we're all Twitter users, we're all Facebook users, that doesn't just, I can reach you as long as you're open and say stuff about you in ways that I wouldn't in person, or the ways that I have no other access for. So now we're exposed to each other. We don't know each other. And sometimes the response can be, you did this thing. And for clergy, I think it's probably, or pastors, it's probably a chance to say, oh, wait, I have to respond differently because one, I'm in the public eye. Two, I'm people who I don't know are going to think and have a kind of a relationship with me that I don't know about, and what I say will matter.
There is nuance. As much as we like to say, it's cut and dry. Some things are very cut and dry in the situations with this sort of thing.
Yes.
There are a lot of things where we don't know what conversations are happening locally. And it is that complicated public social media pastoral. Like, is this person pastoring all of us? Influencing all of us? And what I love about this conversation, this sort of thing, and even in the whole context of even your book, is that I don't see you as like trying to take down the man in this. Like, you care about the health of this because of the goodness that we've seen that has happened. And having some clarifying questions is really good for the culture of our religious organizations. It's good when you find out everybody has different understandings of like expectation. Like, this is a conversation. Oh, I assumed that the pastors did this and the pastors were assuming one other thing. If we all are on the same page and know, then you have less of it doesn't feel deceptive. It doesn't feel as. So
one of the things you learn in religion as a reporter is you're not in charge of winning in these things.
Oh,
you're not competing with it. Okay. You want to find the truth. You don't have to win. Now you will report if somebody says this, like especially a public official says something and you can prove them not true. You're going to report that. You're after the truth. You're not after winning. When it comes to religion, especially, winning is not the thing. understanding is the thing. And you
Yeah.
listen to understand. So, because when people talk about God in our culture, they're often trying to win or reinforce their own values. But to listen to people who understand what they go and say, oh, you believe that? Well, how does that work? And
Yeah.
how does that work, not just theoretically, but how does that work in your life? So the whole, who's in charge of what sort of stuff. The
Yeah.
whole
And so like when
yeah,
you did an article on plagiarism that involved the pastor that I had,
yeah,
what I thought was really interesting about this is that you were able to talk to a bunch of different people, have different approaches to sermons, and then it can start a conversation that's
yeah,
really helpful. Hopefully, that will inspire some hyper local
yeah,
conversations where people can make decisions that impact their lives. And that, I think that is one of the superpowers of journalism, is
yeah,
that you can start a good conversation that will continue on. Those little ripples will keep happening. Locally, it'll change someone's life. You might not know,
yeah,
but you gave people access to information in a way they didn't have
yeah,
before. And you didn't have to make a ruling. You're not making a ruling on it. You're
yeah.
just saying, this is what's happening. This is the impact. Here are the different thoughts on it. And then
Yeah,
you have this interesting article. Every once in a while, something will come up. You can be like, hey, I wrote this article.
yeah. That
And
was
then,
one. Yeah,
so
exactly. And then you can say, like, with that pastor who found a new church, you could say, well, this is what the pastor did. Is he doing it in the future? Oh, he's doing it in the future.
yeah,
I'm gonna call the church and say, did you know this?
yeah,
And maybe they knew, and maybe they didn't know, and maybe they took them a while to figure out, that this person was wrong, and maybe they were embarrassed by it, and they felt they're a very private
hmm,
organization.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
then we have realized, and you had pointed out to me, like, this is different.
yeah,
This
yeah,
this this guy that like just preaches other people's sermons all the time
yeah,
and has other things that are going on,
yeah. And it's lying
obviously.
to the
It
people,
didn't just
Yeah.
stay in the
Oh yeah,
sermons. It was a systemic like deception
yeah,
and abusive. It's really different than the situation that happened where somebody's preaching J.D. Greer's
yeah,
sermon and they've had a long history of like really serving their church.
yeah,
And they
and
probably should have said this was a J.D. Greer sermon, but
yeah,
they didn't have like a decade of like deception that goes
yeah.
along with it. So that's the nuance that people don't always love to
Yep.
hear, but
Oh yeah, no. And there's this whole really interesting thing going on now too, that you have so many people from so many different backgrounds who are now involved in different churches, and
mhm.
they're seeing it all online. So they all have different expectations of what is a sermon or what is
Yeah.
whatever the pastor's doing.
We're like, I go to a
What?
Methodist church and we all do the same sermon the same
Yeah, we go
Sunday
same thing.
every
Yeah, yeah.
we go through the
The
book.
lectionary, right? So there's like,
Yeah.
oh, how does this all? And then people sell these sermon tips, and
Mhm.
then you have bivocational pastors,
Yeah.
and then you have pastors now that have become communicators, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so that was and a communicator is different than a preacher.
Yeah. Well, and your job as a reporter isn't to say
Yeah,
what they should be doing. It's to
yeah.
say, here's
No,
what's
say
happening.
this is
This is the culture that's happening. This is what's happening right now in
yeah,
2022.
yeah,
And this is how this church is dealing with it. This is how this denomination is having the conversation. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, it's very interesting because like, what should they be doing? Well, everyone has
Is
because
there a should? Yeah.
there should, and how does this going to work? And
You're making it
uh,
hard for people to paint you as like the person trying to like shame all the pastors that
yeah,
don't
no, I
cite
mean
people
it's
the
all
same way.
they can, and I think the pastors are all having a conversation because they're all only talking to pastors
Yeah.
about what they think are the ethics or a set of pastoral
Yeah.
ethics, and then there are what are the ethics of the people watching in my
Yeah.
congregation, and then what are the expectations of the people outside my congregation having about what you're
Yeah.
saying, and then what is the generalized turning everything into content that's to be consumed and monetized, done to the way that people preach and
Yeah.
teach and
And
talk.
when your name is attached to the thing that ends up being monetized, and the thing is something that somebody else
Yeah,
created, that's those are the tricky questions. So
yeah, yeah. No, it's a very
yeah,
it's complicated. People are very complicated, and they're not. I
they
mean,
are.
people do good. People do terrible things. Terrible people do terrible things. People think they're doing the right thing
And
and do the
yeah,
wrong thing.
some terrible people do
Uh,
good things.
like the reporting thing, it's all relationships.
Yeah.
And I mean that like in that you have, it's how you approach people. It's, can I be trustworthy? If I'm not trustworthy, then everyone's going to know it pretty quickly. I mean, there are reporters I wouldn't talk to. And this is, I'm going to quote an old white English guy, but Chesterton has a great line in one of his books. I think it's Orthodoxy, about how bigger your life would be if you were smaller in it.
Mm.
It's a great, like, it's like if everyone else was the person doing their thing and you were one person among a bunch of people living this out, rather than you are there are people in your show. It's like a great line. It's like, oh, that's true. If I'm smaller in it, then I can, because I know what I think, and I'm not very, I guess I shouldn't say this. I'm really interesting. You should all listen to this podcast. But, I don't want to know what I think. I want to know what other people think.
So my last question for you,
yes,
because I probably, you got to go back to reporting because, breaking news and all this. You don't go to a Southern Baptist church.
No.
But you lived in a very Southern Baptist area for a long time.
Yes.
And you have friends that you consider, people that you consider friends that are Southern Baptist.
Oh, yeah.
What was it like to have like Russell Moore say to Beth Moore, Bob's the guy to talk to. You can trust
that was
him.
nice.
Because you were at the right time, you were online. She says something and you say, hey, I have a question about this.
Yes.
And, she's a very public person, has dealt with a lot of things. Makes a lot of sense for her to reach out and say, what should I do? And to have Russell Moore say, I think Bob could do this story. What was that like?
Yeah, no, it's nice. It's nice to have people think that you are going to treat them fairly and do the right thing. And, not because you have a reputation of doing the right thing. And I think that's what you try to do long term. It takes a long time. So that story is like, I moved to Nashville in 2007. That story runs to 20. So it's 14 years of work of trying to do the right thing.
14 years of how you did your work.
Yes.
The relationships you had, being respectful to the people, and you didn't go to a Southern Baptist church, but you were very embedded in that world and seeing how it worked. And
for a little bit, actually, we did go to a Southern Baptist church, but they were pretending not to be Southern Baptist. Yeah. But then they imploded.
As we wrapped up this conversation, I asked about a quote Bob had shared about religion making the world less awful. Who was it? Was that you? Whose quote was religion about making the world less awful?
Oh, it's Ryan Burge. Ryan Burge from Eastern Illinois University. That's what religion can do is best. It makes the world less awful.
Yeah.
So then you try and say, well, I don't want to contribute to the awfulness of the world. I want to try and contribute to the understanding of the world as best as I can. And it's much more fun. I mean, everybody else just wants to fight. And so if I can not fight, it's kind of nice.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have people that, say to you, okay, I respect that you did this. You got it kind of right. Okay, that's good. That's what you want. It's a really interesting time right now.
It is.
And it's interesting to hear other people's point of view. And if you're not trying to win, I think that really does help. I can't get you to, I can't get rid of you as much as I would want to, right? Not you, but people in general. Like the people I don't like.
Yeah. So if you're trying to win, and I'm still going to always be there as the loser.
Yeah. But we're still all going to be in the same thing together. And how do we do this long term?
Bob, thank you.
All right. Great talk to you.
This is so fun. Here's one last thing that I underlined from Bob's new book. Faith harms and heals. It pulls us apart and binds us together. It builds cathedrals and burns down cities. It gives life and brings death. Asking if religion is good is like asking if music is good, or food, or politics, or baseball, or books, or art, or science, or any other human endeavor. Religion is human, and it matters. Thanks so much for listening to the Untangled Faith podcast. Don't forget to check out the rest of my conversation with Bob at patreon.com/untangledfaith. I'd love to keep the conversation going over on Twitter or Instagram or through the Facebook page. I'm Untangled Faith on Instagram and Facebook, and Faith Untangled on Twitter. For more information about supporting the show, check out patreon.com/untangledfaith. You can find show notes at untangledfaithpodcast.com. The Untangled Faith podcast is hosted and edited by me, Amy Fritz. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. This podcast is made possible by support from patrons. Special thanks to producers Michelle Pjanic and Phil and Susan Perdue.